The surprise attack, last-minute decisions, and a war no one could have predicted. Was President Trump truly ready to face the consequences as the U.S. confronted Iran? The secret behind Operation Nighthammer will keep you on the edge of your seat. On the night of June 20th, in a quiet space, amidst the dim lights of the Gold Club, President Donald Trump was enjoying a moment of rest. But beneath that calm exterior, a historic decision was being prepared in absolute secrecy. This was not a decision of an ordinary president. It was the choice of a man, carrying not just the weight of a nation, but of the world. An attack on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities. An attack with no turning back. This decision could change the global landscape, alter the lives of millions, and mark a turning point in America's military strategy. American fighter jets were ready, pilots on board, and the massive bombs were waiting for the final moment to drop. But in that instant, a sudden question arose in Donald Trump's mind. Do I have the courage to do this? It wasn't just an attack. It was a war with tremendous consequences. If not careful, it could pull the U.S. into a prolonged war, a war he never intended when he took office. But if he did not act, Iran would continue to challenge America's power, continuing to increase the risks to national security. Trump looked out the window, his eyes seemingly fixed on an uncertain future. Before him was an unprecedented, difficult decision in his career, and behind him, a national security team waiting for his final orders. In that heavy atmosphere, he made his decision. We will not back down. It was the statement of a man ready to face all risks, knowing that the consequences could far exceed what he had imagined. On the night of June 21st, the stealth bombers B-2 took off from Missouri base, and no one knew the exact targets until the bombs dropped on Iran's 3 nuclear facilities. It was an uncompromising attack, meticulously prepared over months, with no opportunity for the enemy to retaliate. But behind it lay a sophisticated strategy, not just the destruction of nuclear facilities, but also a powerful message from President Trump to Iran and the world. If you don't respect America, there will be serious consequences. As the planes took off, Trump remained at the club, but every emotion within him had changed. In that moment, he was no longer the man relaxing, but the one standing before a decision that could change the fate of an entire region, even the world. Time passed, and he knew that all the preparations would result in the next few hours. But would it be a victory or a disaster? Would this action lead the U.S. into an endless war? U.S. security officials did not sleep. They monitored every minute of the operation. And as the bombers landed, a resounding victory arrived, but there was no celebration, only rising questions. Would Iran accept peace as Trump had hoped, or would it be a long war with no end in sight? Once again, Trump spoke after the campaign was completed. We've succeeded, but the game's not over. That was a message for Iran, but also a warning to other nations that America would never back down from a threat. However, this success, was it truly a victory, or just the first step in a larger conflict that he could not avoid? And just as President Trump declared victory, the world knew that a new chapter of Middle Eastern history had begun, and the coming events would be even more intense than ever. Could America maintain its position, or would it fall into the vortex of endless wars? The tension is rising, but the final answer still lies in the next moves to be made. On June 21st, a day that no one involved in the military campaign would ever forget. At this moment, President Donald Trump was in a life-defining moment. The preparation process had ended. Everything had been meticulously planned. But when the final decision was made, no one could predict what would happen next. The B-2 bombers were ordered to take off from the Missouri base, while U.S. Navy submarines had begun their long journey to carry out an unprecedented attack on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities. As the B-2 bombers left the ground, they carried with them not only the mission to destroy the targets, but also the culmination of a military strategy that President Trump had been preparing for months. Every decision, every detail in the operation had been calculated meticulously. But as the planes took off, one could not help but wonder whether President Trump was truly ready to face all the unpredictable consequences of this attack. Before the night of June 21st, Trump had been under immense pressure. This was not the first time he had to make a life or death decision, but this time was different. The consequences would not only affect him or his advisors, but also directly impact national and global security. The question that always lingered in his mind was, if I make the wrong decision, can everything be controlled? But he knew that once the decision was made, there was no turning back. In the week leading up to the campaign, President Trump had struggled with concerns and fears about the potential aftermath. While he had received the consensus of national security officials, he could not shake the worry about a prolonged war. A part of him secretly hoped that this attack would serve as a deterrent to Iran, forcing them back to the negotiating table to accept the nuclear deal America desired. But was that a realistic scenario, or was it just wishful thinking, an ungrounded hope? U.S. national security officials had spent the entire day discussing the worst-case scenarios. As they prepared for an operation deemed critical to the stability of the region, they could not help but think of Iran's possible retaliation. Would the counterattacks immediately target U.S. military bases in the Middle East? Or would it escalate into a more complex campaign, a proxy war, involving Iranian-aligned forces across the region? And then, the decision was made. The B-2 bombers took off at midnight, heading directly toward Iran's nuclear facilities. The 18-hour journey was no small feat for the pilots, but they knew ahead of them was a mission that would define the future of their nation. Meanwhile, officials in Washington kept a constant watch, eyes glued to the screens, waiting for the final outcome. As the first bombs fell, the atmosphere seemed to choke. How would Iran respond? Would they see this as a declaration of war, or would they find a more covert way to react? The U.S. had prepared for all scenarios, but no one could predict exactly what Iran's next move would be. America's allies, especially Israel, had been notified in advance, but the question still remained. Would the world witness a larger confrontation, or was this just a lone military event, leaving only destruction behind? As soon as the attack concluded, President Trump spoke, declaring the mission a success. But was the price for this success a prolonged war? He had warned Iran that if they did not change, greater and much easier attacks would follow. But behind these statements was a considerable concern. Everything had just begun, and no military or political leader could know exactly what would happen next. The questions remained, and this campaign was just one part of a larger geopolitical picture. A military victory did not mean the end of the issue. The entire world was waiting for Iran's next move, and whether Trump could maintain his strategy without pushing everything too far. As night fell, people in Washington still could not tear their eyes away from the screen, listening for news from the Middle East. Would this be the turning point Trump needed to solidify his legacy, or the beginning of a larger crisis no one could foresee? After the attack, the reverberations were still felt among both U.S. and Iranian leaders, along with the reactions from other countries. The aftermath of the bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear facilities was not just a military victory, but also a strong statement from President Donald Trump to the opposing forces. But did this really resolve the issue? Or was it merely the opening move in a chain of unpredictable, uncontrollable events? Certainly, the campaign achieved its initial objective. 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities were destroyed, and the military power of the U.S. was clearly demonstrated. But the issue President Trump faced was not just the short-term military gains. The long-term consequences were what truly mattered. Although the bombs had exploded, a full-scale war wouldn't necessarily end with a single strike. President Trump had succeeded in destroying Iran's nuclear facilities, but that didn't mean they would easily accept defeat and make concessions. The response from Iran was what the entire world awaited. While the U.S. claimed victory, Iran showed no signs of weakness or surrender. They did not accept defeat easily. On the contrary, Iran spoke out forcefully, asserting that they would retaliate, although their method of response might differ. These statements were not empty threats, but serious warnings, showing that Iran was not defeated. It was these warnings that stirred anxiety in the minds of U.S. leaders. Would a direct conflict with Iran unfold? Or would it be a series of covert, indirect attacks, or even a prolonged proxy war across the region? However, within this tense context, one hard truth became unavoidable. The U.S. had pushed itself into a no-turning-back situation. While it could claim military victory, was this victory sustainable? Could this attack pull the U.S. Senate into a long-lasting war with unpredictable results? In the tense discussions at the White House, U.S. officials faced a big question. Can the U.S. sustain this strategy long-term? Military victories, no matter how resounding, cannot protect a country from long-term risks without a strong accompanying diplomatic strategy. And the world wasn't just waiting for a response from Iran. America's allies, particularly Israel and the Arab League nations, were also watching closely. They wondered whether the U.S. could maintain its strength in the region. Could the U.S. continue to safeguard its allies while also facing the rising challenge from Iran? All of these questions remained unanswered. And these very questions were what kept the tension high, only escalating further with time. But in that moment, one thing became clear. The confrontation between the U.S. and Iran was not just a military conflict. It was a battle of values, politics, and long-term strategy. President Trump had made a bold decision, but he also understood that every action taken by the U.S. would trigger global reactions beyond control. His decision was not just about military strategy, but part of a broader strategy regarding America's influence in the Middle East, a region always at the heart of global tensions. In this context, the U.S. must continue to face questions that are not easy to answer. Could they maintain their position in the region? Would the escalation of the conflict become a long-lasting nightmare, or could a strategic shift ease the tensions? Could the world coexist with a stronger Iran, or would the U.S. continue to lead the way, maintaining its power? After the attack, President Trump warned Iran that there would be bigger and easier attacks if they did not seek peace. But were these warnings strong enough to prevent a prolonged war? Would Trump face an even harder choice in the future? Continue military intervention or find a way to negotiate a peace deal? These questions not only affect the U.S., but also the entire world, as both major nations and international organizations are witnessing the changing dynamics in the Middle East. In the end, the only thing we can be certain of is this. The confrontation is every decision could lead to unforeseen upheavals. So, what do you think about President Trump's Operation Nighthammer? Will the U.S. face a prolonged war, or is this just a decisive strategic move? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss.